Marcus Thorne stood apart, his shadow long and bent by the angle of the sun, arms crossed over his chest, hat brim low. He hadn't planned on riding into town that day. He hadn't planned anything, not for years. Not since the fever took his wife, leaving behind only silence and cracked earth. But the axle on his wagon had cracked a mile out, and fate, that mean old woman, led him to the town square just as the auctioneer's voice rose over the crowd. And there she stood. A Chinese woman, barely more than a girl, worn thin as if life had wrung her out early. There was a straightness to her back that dared the world not to pity her. A faded tunic hung loose over her swollen belly. One hand pressed lightly to the curve, the other holding the fingers of a little girl beside her, silent as a stone, her dark eyes wide and unblinking. Found on the edge of the territory, the auctioneer called, forcing cheer into the shameful affair. Husband was a rail worker, met with an accident. No debts, no kin. She's healthy, quiet, and comes with the child. A cruel joke. That's what it was. Men nudged each other, snickering behind their hands. No one wanted the burden, the talk, the trouble of a foreign widow carrying another man's baby. She was an object of curiosity, not a person in need. A low bid of $1 was called out, followed by a ripple of laughter. It wasn't an offer, it was an insult, meant to set her worth at nothing. Marcus did not think. His boots shifted forward before he understood why. The woman's eyes darted up, dark and deep, startled but not hopeful. He stopped beside the platform and pulled a folded bill from his coat. $5, he said, his voice a low rumble. The auctioneer blinked, the smirk falling from his face. You sure about that, Thorne? It's a complicated lot. The crowd murmured. Marcus Thorne, the man who spoke to no one, who hadn't been seen at church in years, was bidding on the town's cruel joke. He simply nodded once, holding out the money. The transaction was quiet and final. The auctioneer pocketed the bill and shrugged at the woman. Guess you're his. The little girl glanced between them. She looked more like a fawn than a child, nervous, thin, dark hair tangled down her back. But there was no fear in her, only observation. She studied Marcus the way wild things do, measuring threat and safety in a single glance. Marcus turned. Come on. The woman didn't thank him. She just stepped off the platform and followed, one hand on her belly, the other holding tight to her daughter. They passed through the town like ghosts. A store clerk turned a sign to it closed, though it was not yet noon. Even the sheriff, leaning against his office door, gave Marcus a long look. You've got a reputation for loneliness, Thorne, he called. Don't add foolish to it. Marcus said nothing. At the edge of town, his horse stood tethered. He lifted the little girl onto the saddle, and she clung to the pommel, looking back at the town with a stare far too old for her size. The woman climbed up behind her, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. Marcus walked beside them, reins in hand, boots kicking up dust as the sky dimmed. They rode in silence across the prairie. By the time they reached his ranch, a plain house with a sloping roof and a barn in need of mending, the light had softened. He helped the girl down. The woman stood before the house for a long moment, looking at it like a test she hadn't studied for. I'll sleep in the barn, Marcus said, his voice low. You take the house. She shook her head. We'll take the floors. You'll take the bed, he said, and turned toward the barn before she could argue. He lit a lantern in the house for them, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. The woman entered first, her shoulders stiff. The little girl followed, trailing the scent of rain and soil. He watched as she led the child toward the single bedroom, their footsteps soft as if afraid to disturb the quiet. The door clicked shut. He was turning to leave when her voice, clear and unaccented, stopped him cold. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. You should not have done this, she said. It wasn't a thank you, nor a complaint. It was a statement of fact. Marcus turned back. It's done. They will follow, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The men my husband owed. They do not forgive debts. His blood ran cold. This wasn't charity, it was a reckoning he'd just purchased for $5. He had bought more than a widow, he'd bought her trouble, a danger that now had a name and a direction, pointed right at his door. The days that followed passed in a muted quiet. She never gave her name, and he never asked. It was as though naming things might break the fragile balance between them. She moved through the house like a phantom, leaving no trace but for the scent of unfamiliar herbs and the quiet order she brought to the dusty space. The child, Mai, as he'd overheard her mother murmur, was quieter still. She explored with her eyes, watching the world as though waiting for it to shift beneath her feet. Marcus rose before dawn, working the land, fixing what had long sat broken. Fences, tools, hinges he hadn't had reason to mend before. Now, with 2 new hearts beating under his roof, he found himself reaching for repairs he'd once let slide. She cooked. Not much, but she made do with his sparse supplies. Cornbread, stew, a thin soup that tasted of ginger and something he couldn't name. They rarely spoke, but in the quiet, something softened. Mai followed him to the barn one morning. She didn't ask, just appeared in the doorway, fingers wrapped around the frame. He glanced at her, nodded once, and kept brushing his mare. After a moment, she stepped inside, her eyes fixed on the great animal. The mare, usually skittish around strangers, lowered her head and let out a soft huff. Horses knew grief, and they knew gentleness. The girl was both. The town, of course, did not stay silent. By the end of the week, Mrs. Gable rode up in her buggy, her face a mask of pious concern. She didn't cross the threshold, just called out, her voice sharp as a church bell. "Mr. Thorne, I do hope you're being careful. A man in your position, such charity can be misunderstood. It's not proper, having one of them in your home." Marcus met her gaze from the porch, arms folded. "A roof and a meal ain't charity. It's decency." Still, she sniffed, folks are asking questions. It's an unnatural arrangement. "Then let them," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Mrs. Gable turned her buggy back toward town, her disapproval hanging in the air like dust. The woman watched from the window, her expression unreadable. That evening, she mended his work shirt. Marcus found it folded at the edge of the table, the tear stitched so neatly it seemed new again. As dusk fell, he found her outside, her belly stretching tight beneath her tunic. She moved slowly, a weariness in her bones. "You should be resting," he said. She didn't look at him. "What's left of me isn't yours to worry over." "I'm not worrying," he said quietly. She turned then, meeting his eyes. That night, Mai laughed for the first time. She had found a stray kitten that had wandered into the yard and was chasing it barefoot, giggling as it darted and dodged. The woman stepped out onto the porch beside Marcus, a faint smile on her lips. "She hasn't laughed in months," she murmured. "It's a good sound," Marcus replied. One night, the woman placed a hand on the kitchen table, her fingers trembling slightly. "We can leave soon. Once I've worked enough to earn back what you spent." Marcus didn't look up from oiling a piece of leather. "Wasn't alone." Her jaw tightened. "Still, I do not want to stay where I am not welcome." He finally met her gaze. "You're not unwelcome here." She studied him, then softly asked, "Why did you do it?" "That day in town." Marcus looked past her to the window, where Mai was crouched by the fire, humming to herself. Seemed like the only decent thing left to do. A quiet settled between them, heavy with unspoken things. Outside, the wind had shifted. The cabin was still filled with silence, but now it hummed with something else, too. Something quieter, waiting. Just before bed, Marcus found a small drawing Mai had made in the soot near the hearth. It was a horse, but beside it stood a figure with a crooked hat. She had scratched one word beneath it in soft, crooked letters, "Safe." Marcus stared at it for a long time, and for the first time in years, he slept easy, though the woman's warning echoed in the back of his mind. "They will follow." The warning became real a week later. Hoof prints, not made by his mare, appeared on the ridge trail. Too fresh, too deep. Marcus followed them with a quiet frown. They led toward the creek and vanished. He didn't like it. At the cabin, the woman stood on the porch, rubbing her lower back. "I think he is here," she said without preamble. Her voice had gone flat again, the way it was when she first arrived. "His name is Kai. He was my husband's partner. He believes everything my husband owned now belongs to him. Including me. He won't take anything," Marcus said, his voice firm. By afternoon, a rider appeared, a silhouette against the sun, coming down the trail like a man who already owned the land he crossed. He sat on a black horse, staring at the cabin. He was younger than Marcus expected, but his eyes were old and mean, slick with the certainty of a man who'd never been told no. Marcus walked toward the gate, his hands empty but his posture rigid. "You have no claim here," he said as the rider pulled up. The man, Kai, laughed, a short, sharp sound. "I heard a fool bought my property. You must be the one. She belongs to the Tong. Her husband's debt is now her debt. That is our way. She's not property." Behind him, the screen door creaked. The woman stepped out, her face pale but unshaken. "You have no honor, Kai," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You use our traditions as an excuse for your greed." Kai's smile was cruel. "You think this man will protect you? A lonely farmer? He will tire of you. Then you and your children will be mine." "Get off my land," Marcus said, his voice dangerously low. Kai dismounted in one fluid motion. "I could take her right now. You think this town cares about a Chinese girl? They sold her to you for the price of a drink." "I care," Marcus said. "That's enough." Kai swung first, a quick jab meant to provoke. It clipped Marcus's jaw. He didn't stagger. He just stood there. "That all you got?" he asked. Then Marcus moved. The punch he threw was deliberate, clean, landing squarely in Kai's chest. The man gasped, stumbling back, the breath knocked from him. Marcus didn't follow it up. He just stood like a wall the wind couldn't move. "Leave," the woman said, stepping off the porch. "There's nothing for you here." Kai stared at her, then at Marcus, and with a sneer, he turned back toward his horse. He mounted, spat in the dust, and rode off without looking back. The wind died with him. Later, as the fire burned low, the woman sat across from Marcus, her hands folded over her belly. "I didn't think anyone would ever stand for me," she whispered. "I didn't stand for you," Marcus said gently. "I stood with you." She blinked quickly, looking down at her hands. That night, the house didn't hum with silence. It hummed with something fuller, something earned. There was no declaration, no kiss. But when Marcus set a second cup of coffee beside her in the morning, and she took it without hesitation, it felt like more than enough. He finally asked her name. "Lin," she said, and a door inside her seemed to creak open. He repeated it once, letting it settle. "Lin." That evening, May drew another picture by the hearth. A tall man with a crooked hat, a woman with sunlight in her hair, and a little girl between them, holding both their hands. In the bottom corner, in crooked letters, she wrote a single word, home. Somewhere, people would still talk. But on this land, beneath this roof, the only voice that mattered was the one that had chosen to stay. In the end, it wasn't about what Marcus did to shock the town. It was what he did after, when no one was watching. He saw a person where others saw property, and in the quiet space of his forgotten ranch, he didn't just offer shelter. He offered a place to stand, and in doing so, built a home.